There are some phone calls you remember for the rest of your life. For Robert Whitmore, the call came at 2:17 on a cold Tuesday morning. He was sitting alone in the kitchen of the house where he had raised 3 children, staring at a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. His wife, Evelyn, was asleep down the hallway. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. Then his phone rang. It was his son Daniel, the same son Robert had once carried on his shoulders, the same son whose first car Robert had helped him buy, the same son who, years earlier, had promised that no matter how successful he became, he would never forget where he came from. Robert answered. He expected to hear his son's voice. Instead, Daniel said something that would stay with him until his final days. "Dad, you need to understand something. We can't keep doing this." Robert looked across the kitchen at the family photographs covering the wall. There was Daniel at 8 years old, Michael at 5, Sarah between them, smiling with missing front teeth. There was Evelyn holding all 3 children on Christmas morning. There was Robert standing behind them, exhausted from another 12-hour shift, but smiling anyway. He had spent his entire life believing those photographs represented something permanent. Family, loyalty, gratitude. He was wrong. Because by the time Daniel finished that phone call, Robert understood that his children had become wealthy enough to forget the people who had sacrificed everything to make their success possible. And what Robert did not know that night was that this was only the beginning. Years later, after the family had been torn apart, after money had changed hands, after promises had been broken, and after one devastating discovery forced the Whitmore children to confront what they had done, Daniel would return to that same house. But the person waiting for him inside would not be the father he remembered. And the reason Daniel came back would have nothing to do with money. The Whitmore family did not begin with betrayal. That is important, because families rarely fall apart in a single dramatic moment. More often, the distance begins quietly. A missed birthday, a phone call that never gets returned, a Thanksgiving invitation that is declined because work is too busy, a promise to visit next month that becomes next year. And eventually, the people who once knew everything about one another become strangers who happen to share the same last name. For decades, Robert and Evelyn Whitmore believed they had done everything a parent was supposed to do. They worked, they saved, they sacrificed. They gave their children opportunities they never had themselves. Daniel became successful. Michael became successful. Sarah remained close to home. And from the outside, it looked like the Whitmore family had achieved the American dream. But then something changed. The children began making more money than their parents had ever imagined. Their houses became larger. Their cars became more expensive. Their vacations became more extravagant. Their circles changed. Their priorities changed. And slowly, Robert and Evelyn became less important. But why? Was it simply ambition? Did wealth change Daniel and Michael? Or had something been broken inside the family long before the money arrived? And perhaps the most painful question of all was this. If Robert and Evelyn had known what was coming, would they have raised their children differently? Because years later, when Daniel finally understood what he had lost, there was one thing he would desperately want to change. But it would already be too late. Robert Whitmore was never rich. He was the kind of man who believed that a dollar earned honestly was worth more than $100 obtained through luck. He worked for decades, saved carefully, and rarely complained about what he could not afford. Evelyn was the heart of the home. She remembered everyone's birthdays. She packed lunches. She attended school plays. She sat through football games in freezing weather. She knew which child needed encouragement and which one needed discipline. Daniel was the oldest. From an early age, Robert saw something special in him. Daniel was intelligent, competitive, and determined. When he wanted something, he worked until he got it. Michael was different. He was more relaxed, more social, and more interested in people. He admired his older brother enormously. Sarah was the youngest. She was quieter than her brothers, but she noticed everything. And when the 3 children eventually grew up, it was Sarah who would remember the sacrifices their parents had made. Daniel would remember something else. He would remember being poor. He remembered the old family car. He remembered sharing a bedroom with Michael. He remembered Robert telling him they could not afford certain things. And as Daniel became older, those memories stopped making him grateful. They made him determined never to be poor again. That distinction would eventually change the entire family. Daniel left home after college and entered the corporate world. He worked long hours, accepted promotions, and began making serious money. His first major bonus was larger than his father's annual salary. Daniel bought a luxury apartment, then a larger house, then another property. Michael followed a similar path. The brothers began talking about investments, businesses, and opportunities. The conversations changed. They no longer talked about childhood memories. They talked about net worth. They talked about property values. They talked about retirement. And eventually, they began talking about their parents' house. At first, it was innocent. Robert and Evelyn owned the modest home they had lived in for decades. It was not a mansion. It was not glamorous. But after years of mortgage payments, the property had become one of their most valuable assets. Daniel knew that. Michael knew that. Sarah knew that. But only Sarah seemed to understand that the house was worth more than its market value. It contained every Christmas, every birthday, every argument, every photograph, every memory. To Robert and Evelyn, it was home. To Daniel, it was increasingly becoming an asset. That difference would become one of the most important details in the entire story. The first major change came after Daniel's career took off. He began traveling constantly. At first, he called his parents every Sunday, then every few weeks. Eventually, the calls became brief. "I'm slammed at work. I'm flying out tomorrow. I'll call you later." Robert always understood. That was what fathers like Robert did. They made excuses for their children. When Daniel missed Evelyn's birthday, Robert told her he was probably overwhelmed. When Michael missed Thanksgiving, Robert said he had obligations. When both brothers skipped Christmas one year, Robert insisted they would make it up later. Sarah knew better. She saw the disappointment on her mother's face. She saw Robert sitting at the dinner table pretending not to care. And one night, Sarah finally asked him, "Dad, why do you keep making excuses for them?" Robert looked at her and smiled. "Because they're my sons." That answer explained everything about Robert. He did not want perfection from his children. He only wanted them to remember him. But success had changed Daniel's world, and Michael had begun following his brother's example. The brothers started referring to their parents' lifestyle as small. Their house was too old. Their neighborhood was not safe enough. Their retirement plans were outdated. Daniel began suggesting that Robert and Evelyn sell the house and move somewhere smaller. Robert refused. "This is our home," he said. Daniel laughed. "You can't live here forever, Dad." Robert looked at his son. "No," he said, "but I can live here while I'm alive." Daniel said nothing. It was a small exchange, but Sarah would remember it, because years later, that sentence would return to the family in a completely different context. Then Robert's health began to decline. Not dramatically, not overnight. It happened the way aging often happens. He became slower. He tired more easily. He stopped doing certain things around the house. Evelyn began struggling with everyday tasks too. Suddenly, the parents who had spent decades caring for their children needed someone to care for them. Sarah stepped forward. She drove them to appointments. She handled groceries. She checked on them. She helped with bills. She sat with Evelyn when she was frightened. And when Robert needed help, Sarah was there. Daniel and Michael still loved their parents. At least, they said they did. But love from a distance can become complicated. Daniel sent money. Michael paid for a few things. They told Sarah she was doing an amazing job. But whenever Sarah asked them to spend time with their parents, there was always a reason they couldn't. Work, travel, business, children, deadlines. Eventually, Sarah stopped asking. And Robert noticed. One evening, he asked her why Daniel and Michael did not visit anymore. Sarah hesitated. She did not want to hurt him. So she said what children often say when they are trying to protect their parents. "They're busy, Dad." Robert nodded. But he knew. Parents often know more than their children realize. One afternoon, Daniel arrived unexpectedly. He walked into the house wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Robert smiled. For a moment, he looked like the father he had always been. "My boy," he said. Daniel hugged him. But something about the visit felt different. Daniel sat down at the kitchen table. Michael arrived 20 minutes later. Sarah was already there. Robert looked at both sons. "What's going on?" Daniel placed a folder on the table. "We've been talking about your future." Robert frowned. "My future?" Daniel nodded. "You and Mom need to start thinking practically." Sarah immediately knew where this was going. Daniel explained that the house was becoming difficult to maintain. The property was valuable. The taxes were increasing. Repairs were becoming expensive. He believed the smartest option was to sell. Robert listened quietly. Then he asked the question that changed the temperature in the room. "And where would your mother and I live?" Daniel had an answer. "A smaller condominium." Maybe assisted living eventually. Something easier. Something more practical. Robert looked at Michael. You agree with this? Michael lowered his eyes. Yes, Dad. Sarah stared at her brothers. You're talking about selling their home while they're still living in it. Daniel became defensive. It's not about taking anything away from them. Then what is it about? Daniel paused. And that pause said more than his words could. It was about money. It was about convenience. It was about planning. And perhaps, although nobody said it aloud, it was also about inheritance. Robert pushed the folder back. We're not selling. Daniel stood. Fine. Then he said something that Robert would never forget. You can't expect us to put our lives on hold forever. Robert looked at him. I never asked you to. Daniel walked out. Michael followed. Sarah stayed behind. And that evening, Robert sat alone at the kitchen table. He stared at the door. Then he whispered, I don't know my sons anymore. From that point forward, the family changed. Daniel stopped visiting. Michael visited less. Sarah became the only child consistently present. Robert and Evelyn began relying on her more heavily. And then came another conversation. Daniel called Robert and said he wanted his share of the family's assets eventually planned out. Robert was stunned. He told Daniel that inheritance was not something children were entitled to while their parents were still alive. Daniel responded that he was only trying to protect everyone's interests. The phrase stayed with Robert. Everyone's interests. But whose interests? Robert's? Evelyn's? Sarah's? Or Daniel's? Around this time, Robert confided in Linda Parker, Evelyn's longtime friend. Linda had watched the family change over the years. She had seen Daniel become wealthy. She had seen Michael follow him. And she had seen Sarah become her parents' caregiver. Linda told Robert something he did not want to hear. Robert, sometimes people don't realize the value of something until they believe they're about to lose it. Robert shook his head. They're my boys. Linda answered gently. I know. Then she added, but being your son doesn't automatically make someone a good son. Robert did not respond, because he was not ready to accept that possibility. The Thanksgiving that year became the family's last normal holiday. At least, that's what everyone thought. Evelyn cooked the meal. Robert carved the turkey. Sarah brought dessert. Daniel and Michael arrived late. They were dressed beautifully. They brought expensive gifts. For a few hours, everything looked normal. They laughed. They told old stories. Robert watched his sons from across the table. He seemed happy. Perhaps he believed the family had finally returned to what it used to be. After dinner, Robert asked Daniel to walk outside with him. The two men stood on the porch. Robert looked at his son. You know what I want. Daniel smiled. What? To see you boys together. Daniel nodded. We're good, Dad. Robert looked toward the house. No. Daniel frowned. We're not. Daniel didn't answer. Robert continued. Money comes and goes. Businesses fail. Houses get sold. Cars get replaced. But when your mother and I are gone, all you'll have left is each other. Daniel looked away. He did not understand the weight of those words. Not yet. That night, Daniel drove home in a luxury car. Michael followed behind him, and Sarah stood at the front door watching their taillights disappear. She had a feeling that Thanksgiving had been a goodbye. She just did not know what they were saying goodbye to. The following year, Evelyn became seriously ill. Robert's world narrowed. Doctors, appointments, medication, bills, fear. Sarah became overwhelmed. She asked Daniel and Michael for help. Daniel said he would send money. Michael said he would come when things settled down. But things never settled down. They got worse. Robert began struggling to manage everything. One evening, he called Daniel. Son, I need you. Daniel was silent. What do you need? I need you to come home. Daniel said he would, but he didn't. Days passed, then weeks. And one morning, Sarah found Robert sitting alone in the kitchen. He was holding an old photograph. It was Daniel's graduation picture. Robert stared at it. Your brother used to call me every morning, he said. Sarah sat beside him. I know. What happened? Sarah did not know how to answer. Because there was no single answer. Nothing had exploded. Nobody had committed one dramatic betrayal. It had happened slowly. Success had created distance. Distance had created indifference. Indifference had created resentment. And resentment had turned family into an obligation. Then, one morning, Robert received a letter. It was from Daniel. The letter contained a proposal concerning the house. Daniel wanted Robert and Evelyn to sell. Robert read it twice. Then he folded the paper. He placed it in a drawer. And he said, I'm not giving up my home. The family conflict became more complicated when Sarah began reviewing her parents' finances. There were withdrawals she could not explain, payments she did not recognize, documents she had never seen. At first, she assumed it was a mistake. Then she found more. Sarah called Daniel. "Did you move money from Dad's account?" Daniel immediately became angry. "Who told you to look through their finances?" "I'm their daughter." "So am I." "No, you're their son. I'm the person taking care of them." The silence was enormous. Daniel finally said, "Be careful what you're accusing me of." Sarah replied, "Then explain the missing money." Daniel ended the call. That night, Sarah called James Carter, an attorney recommended by a family friend. James listened. He did not accuse anyone. He simply told Sarah to gather records, bank statements, property documents, legal paperwork, anything connected to her parents' finances. And as Sarah began collecting the documents, she discovered something that made her hands shake. There was paperwork connected to the family home, and Daniel's name appeared in places Sarah did not expect. She called James again. "There's something here you need to see." James asked her what it was. Sarah answered, "I think my brother has been planning for our parents' future without telling them." The confrontation happened at the Whitmore house. Daniel arrived first. Michael came with him. Sarah was there. Robert was sitting at the kitchen table. Evelyn was resting in the next room. James Carter was present as well. Daniel looked at the attorney. "You actually hired a lawyer against your own family?" Sarah replied, "I hired someone because I don't understand what is happening." Daniel turned toward Robert. "Dad, this is ridiculous." Robert looked at his son. "Then tell me what's happening." Daniel began explaining. Every document had an explanation. Every withdrawal had a reason. Every decision had been made, he claimed, because he was trying to protect the family. But then James asked one question. "Why were your parents not told?" Daniel stopped. Michael looked at him. Sarah watched both brothers. And Robert finally understood something that hurt more than the money. His sons had been making decisions about his life while he was still alive. The argument became louder. Daniel accused Sarah of trying to control everything. Sarah accused Daniel of abandoning their parents. Michael tried to calm everyone down. Robert finally raised his voice. "Enough." Everyone stopped. Robert looked at his sons. "You want the house?" Daniel said nothing. "You want the money?" Still nothing. Robert's eyes filled with tears. "Then take it." Sarah looked at him. "Dad." Robert shook his head. "No. Let them hear me." He looked directly at Daniel. "I gave you everything I could." Then he looked at Michael. "I gave you everything I could." His voice broke. And somehow, it still wasn't enough. Nobody spoke. Robert pushed himself away from the table. Then he said the words that would eventually haunt both brothers. "You got rich and forgot who loved you before you had anything." After that confrontation, Daniel stopped speaking to the family. Michael followed. Sarah remained. The Whitmore household became painfully quiet. Evelyn's condition worsened. Robert became weaker. And the brothers continued living their successful lives. Daniel bought another property. Michael expanded his business. They traveled. They attended parties. They posted photographs. From the outside, they appeared to be thriving. But inside the family, something had died. Not a person. Not yet. Something else. The illusion that money could replace family. Then, months later, Daniel received a phone call. It was from Sarah. Her voice was different. Daniel immediately knew something was wrong. "Dad is asking for you." Daniel sat down. "What happened?" Sarah hesitated. "Come home." Daniel drove through the night. For the first time in years, he returned to the house where he had grown up. He walked through the front door. Everything looked smaller. The hallway, the kitchen, the staircase, the photographs. He saw his childhood. He saw the Christmas tree. He saw his mother's old chair. And then he heard his father's voice from the bedroom. "Daniel." Daniel froze. He walked inside. Robert was lying in bed. He looked older than Daniel remembered. Much older. Robert looked at his son. And instead of anger, he smiled. "You came." Daniel sat beside him. "I should have come sooner." Robert looked at him. "Yes." Daniel began crying. "I was wrong, Dad." Robert reached for his hand. But before Robert could answer, there was a sound from the hallway. Sarah was standing there. She was holding an envelope. And the expression on her face told Daniel that the night was not over. Sarah walked into the room. Daniel looked at the envelope. "What is that?" Sarah looked at Robert. Then at Daniel. "Dad wanted you to have this." Daniel took it. His hands were shaking. He opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. It was from Robert. Daniel began reading. The letter did not contain accusations. It did not contain insults. It did not demand money. It contained memories. Robert wrote about the first time Daniel held his little brother. He wrote about Daniel's first day of school. He wrote about the time Daniel broke a window and was terrified to tell the truth. He wrote about the first paycheck Daniel brought home. He wrote about how proud he had been. Then Daniel reached the final paragraph. He stopped. He could not continue. Sarah asked, "What does it say?" Daniel handed her the letter. Sarah read it, and her eyes filled with tears. Robert watched them both. Then he said quietly, "I never wanted your money." Daniel looked at his father. "I only wanted my son back." The room went silent. For Daniel, those words were devastating, because suddenly he understood. He had spent years believing his parents wanted something from him. Money, time, attention, responsibility. But they had never asked for his wealth. They had asked for him, and Daniel had given them everything except himself. He reached for his father's hand. "I don't know how to fix this." Robert looked at him. "Neither do I." Daniel began crying. But then Robert said something that changed the direction of the story. "You're going to have to talk to Michael." Daniel looked toward the doorway. "Why?" Robert answered. "Because you two made the same mistake." Daniel stared at him. "What mistake?" Robert closed his eyes. "Thinking you had all the time in the world. And that is where this story must stop. Because what Daniel discovered the next morning about Michael would force both brothers to confront a truth they had spent years avoiding. The money was never the real inheritance. The house was never the real inheritance. And the greatest loss in the Whitmore family had nothing to do with what would be written in a will. It had already happened. But before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because in the next chapter, Daniel will finally learn why Michael had been so determined to stay away from their parents. He will discover a secret that had been hidden for years. And that secret will force Daniel to ask the one question he had avoided his entire life. Did he really abandon his parents because he became wealthy? Or had he been running from something else all along? And when the answer finally comes, it will change everything you thought you knew about the Whitmore family. The next morning, Daniel woke before sunrise. He had barely slept. His father's words kept repeating in his mind. "You're going to have to talk to Michael." Daniel had spent years believing Michael was simply following his lead. If Daniel stayed away, Michael stayed away. If Daniel complained about their parents, Michael agreed. If Daniel said their father was becoming difficult, Michael nodded. But now, for the first time, Daniel wondered whether he had misunderstood his younger brother completely. At 6:14 that morning, Daniel called Michael. There was no answer. He called again. Nothing. Then, almost an hour later, his phone finally rang. It was Michael. His voice was low. "Where are you?" Daniel asked. "At home. We need to talk." Michael was silent for several seconds. Then he said, "I know." Daniel felt a chill run through him. "Know what?" Michael answered. "That Dad told you." Daniel sat on the edge of the bed. "Told me what?" Michael took a long breath. "That I wasn't the one who wanted to sell the house." Daniel said nothing. Michael continued. "You were." Daniel's expression changed. For years, Daniel had convinced himself that the two brothers had reached every major decision together. But suddenly, Michael was telling him there had always been another side to the story. And Daniel was about to discover that the distance between the brothers was much deeper than he had realized. Michael agreed to meet Daniel at a small coffee shop not far from the neighborhood where they had grown up. When Daniel arrived, Michael was already there. He looked exhausted. Neither brother hugged the other. They simply sat across from each other. Daniel finally spoke. "Tell me everything." Michael looked down at his coffee. "You really don't remember?" "Remember what?" "The night Dad told us he wanted us to stay close." Daniel frowned. Michael began explaining. Years earlier, shortly after Daniel had moved away and started making serious money, Michael had asked his brother for advice. He wanted to build a business of his own. Daniel had told him that if he wanted to succeed, he needed to stop thinking like their parents. Michael remembered the exact words. "Dad and Mom are comfortable because they're afraid to take risks." At the time, Michael admired Daniel. He believed his brother understood the world better than anyone. So he followed him. But there was something Daniel never knew. Michael had always felt guilty. Every time he ignored their parents' calls, he felt guilty. Every time he skipped a holiday, he felt guilty. Every time Sarah asked him to visit, he felt guilty. But Daniel always made him feel that guilt was weakness. "You have your own family now," Daniel would say. "You can't keep living in the past." Michael believed him. Until one day, he stopped believing him. Daniel stared at his brother. Then why didn't you tell me? Michael looked up. Because you were my big brother. Daniel looked away. Michael continued. I thought if you were doing it, it must be right. That sentence hurt Daniel more than any accusation could have. Because suddenly, he understood something terrifying. Michael had not simply abandoned their parents. He had learned how to abandon them from Daniel. Michael reached into his briefcase. He removed a folder. I've had this for years. Daniel opened it. Inside were copies of emails, bank records, and correspondence between Michael and Daniel. Daniel read through them slowly. Then he stopped. One email was dated nearly 6 years earlier. Michael had written, I'm worried about Mom and Dad. I think they're struggling more than they're telling us. Daniel's response was simple. Sarah is there. She'll handle it. Another message from Michael said, I think we should visit more. Daniel responded, You're letting guilt control you. Daniel stared at the pages. He remembered sending those messages. At the time, they had seemed harmless. Now they looked different. He realized that some of the most damaging decisions in a family do not look cruel when they are made. They look practical, reasonable, even responsible. That's how people convince themselves they are doing nothing wrong. Daniel looked at Michael. Why did you keep these? Michael answered, Because I knew one day I'd have to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining it. Daniel closed the folder. You could have stopped me. Michael's eyes filled with tears. So could you. Neither brother spoke. For the first time, there was no argument. No blame. Only two middle-aged men sitting across from one another, finally realizing that they had spent years waiting for someone else to accept responsibility. When Daniel and Michael returned to the Whitmore house, Sarah was waiting. She knew they had spoken. She could see it in their faces. What did you find out? She asked. Daniel answered honestly. We both failed. Sarah shook her head. You're only realizing that now? Daniel accepted the criticism. Yes. Sarah looked at Michael. And you? Michael nodded. Yes. Sarah walked toward the kitchen. For years, she had carried anger that neither brother understood. She had been the one answering the phone at midnight. She had been the one driving their mother to appointments. She had been the one sitting beside Robert when he was frightened. She had been the one hearing her parents ask, Why don't the boys come anymore? And every time, she had protected her brothers. She had told Robert and Evelyn that Daniel and Michael were busy. She had defended them, even when she was angry. Now she finally said what she had been holding inside. You both think the worst part was the money. Daniel looked at her. It wasn't. She continued. The worst part was watching them wait. Michael lowered his head. Sarah's voice trembled. Mom would sit by the window on Sundays because she thought one of you might come. Daniel closed his eyes. She never told us. She shouldn't have had to. Then Sarah said something that neither brother would ever forget. Your parents didn't need rich sons. They needed sons. Robert's condition continued to worsen. The family began preparing for the possibility that he did not have much time left. One afternoon, Robert asked Daniel to sit beside him. Son. Yes, Dad. Are you still angry with Michael? Daniel shook his head. No. Robert smiled. Good. Daniel looked confused. Why? Because you two have spent enough years fighting over things that won't matter when you're old. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Robert continued. Promise me something. What? Don't let this house become the reason you hate each other. Daniel looked around the room. This house is all we have left. Robert shook his head. No. Then he pointed toward an old photograph. That is what you have left. Daniel looked at the photograph. It showed Robert, Evelyn, and their 3 children standing outside the house many years earlier. Robert said, The house is wood, brick, glass, land. Money can replace all of it. He paused. But you cannot replace a family. Daniel held his father's hand. I promise. Robert smiled. Then he said, Now promise your brother. Daniel turned toward Michael. Michael walked closer. The 2 brothers stood beside their father. Daniel said, I promise. Michael nodded. I promise too. Robert closed his eyes. For the first time in years, his face looked peaceful. But the family still had one final problem. There was a will. And what it contained would force Daniel and Michael to confront everything they believed about their inheritance. After Robert died, the family gathered with James Carter. Evelyn sat quietly. Sarah sat beside her. Daniel and Michael were across the room. James opened the estate documents. The brothers expected a division of assets. Perhaps the house would be sold. Perhaps the money would be divided. Perhaps there would be another argument. Instead, James read the first instruction. Robert had left the family home to Evelyn for the rest of her life. After that, the property was to be divided equally among the 3 children. Daniel looked at Sarah. Michael looked at Daniel. Then James continued. Robert had also created separate accounts for each child. But there was a condition. The money could not be accessed immediately. Instead, each child had to complete a requirement. Daniel had to spend 12 months volunteering with an organization serving elderly people living alone. Michael had to do the same. Sarah's requirement was different. She was asked to take a year for herself. James explained that Robert had written a personal note. He had recognized how much Sarah had sacrificed. He did not want her to spend the rest of her life taking care of everyone else. Daniel stared at the documents. His father had understood everything, even at the end. Then James handed Daniel one final envelope. It contained a letter. Daniel opened it. Robert had written, "My sons, if you are reading this, I am gone. Please don't spend the rest of your lives arguing over what I left behind. I want you to ask yourselves what you left behind while I was still here." Daniel could not continue reading. Michael took the letter. His hands trembled, and the brothers began to cry. For the first time, Daniel walked through the house without thinking about its value. He walked through the kitchen. He remembered breakfast before school. He walked upstairs. He remembered arguing with Michael over the bathroom. He entered his childhood bedroom. The walls were different now. The furniture was gone, but the memories remained. Michael stood in the doorway. "Remember that hole in the wall?" Daniel laughed through his tears. "Dad blamed me. You did it. You pushed me." Michael smiled. "You deserved it." For a few seconds, they were children again. Not wealthy businessmen. Not men with expensive houses. Not men arguing about inheritance. Just 2 brothers. Then Daniel noticed something written inside the old closet. Their names, Daniel and Michael, written in pencil decades earlier. Daniel touched the wall. "We were happy." Michael nodded. "We were." Then Michael said, "Maybe we forgot." Daniel looked at him. "No." He corrected himself. "We chose to forget." That distinction mattered, because regret is painful, but accountability is harder. And Daniel was finally ready to accept both. Daniel began volunteering at a senior community center. At first, he hated it. He was used to boardrooms. He was used to people listening when he spoke. He was used to controlling his schedule. Now he was spending afternoons listening to elderly men and women talk about their children. Some had children who lived across the country. Some had children who rarely called. Some had children who were dead. Some had children who simply disappeared. One elderly man named Frank told Daniel, "My son sends me money every month." Daniel smiled. "That's generous." Frank looked at him. "Yes." Then he said, "But I'd trade every dollar for one Sunday with him." Daniel froze. The sentence felt like something his father had said without saying it. That night, Daniel sat in his car and cried. He called Michael. "Are you awake?" "Yes." "I understand, Dad, now." Michael was silent. Daniel continued. "He never wanted our money." Michael answered. "I know. He wanted us." "I know." Daniel asked, "What are we going to do?" Michael answered, "Whatever we can." But there was one thing they could not do. They could not go back. They could not give Robert another birthday. They could not give Evelyn another Christmas with both sons at the table. They could not erase the years they had missed. They could only decide what kind of men they would become from that point forward. Evelyn lived for several more years. During that time, she watched her sons change. Daniel began visiting every Sunday. Michael came every Wednesday. Sarah finally stopped being the family's caretaker. The brothers took turns. They cooked. They cleaned. They listened. They became sons again. But Evelyn did something neither expected. She refused to let them turn her into a symbol of their guilt. One afternoon, Daniel apologized again. "Mom, I should have been here." Evelyn looked at him. "Yes." Daniel looked down. "I wish I could change it." "You can't." "I know." "Then stop trying to punish yourself." Daniel looked at her. Evelyn continued. "Your father forgave you." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "Did you?" Evelyn smiled. "I forgave you a long time ago." Daniel whispered. "Why?" "Because I'm your mother." Then she added, "But forgiveness doesn't mean pretending it never happened." Daniel nodded. That was the lesson he needed. Forgiveness did not erase consequences. It simply allowed people to stop carrying them forever. Several months later, Sarah found another letter. It had been tucked inside an old book belonging to Robert. It was addressed to all 3 children. Sarah called Daniel and Michael. They gathered around the kitchen table. Sarah opened it. Robert had written, "There will come a day when you have more money than I ever had. When that day comes, Remember that wealth is only useful if it makes you better people. The letter continued. Don't measure your success by the size of your house. Measure it by how many people feel safe when they see you. Daniel looked down. Michael wiped his eyes. Sarah continued reading. Your mother and I never gave you everything. We couldn't. But we gave you something more important. We gave you a place to come home to. Then came the final sentence. If you ever lose your way, come home. The three siblings sat in silence. Because now they understood. The house had never been about inheritance. It had always been about belonging. Several years after Robert's death, the Whitmore family gathered for Christmas. The house looked almost the same. The old decorations were still there. The kitchen still smelled like Evelyn's cooking. Sarah arrived first. Michael brought food. Daniel carried a box of old photographs. They sat around the table. Nobody talked about money. Nobody mentioned property values. Nobody discussed inheritance. Daniel opened the photograph album. There was Robert holding baby Michael. There was Evelyn holding Sarah. There was Daniel standing proudly beside his first bicycle. They laughed. Then Daniel found the photograph of all three children outside the house. He looked at it for a long time. Michael leaned over. Dad really loved this place. Sarah smiled. He loved you. Daniel nodded. I know that now. Then he looked around the table. I wish I had known sooner. Sarah reached across and took his hand. You know now? For the first time, that was enough. Daniel eventually became one of the wealthiest people in his professional circle. He still owned expensive properties. He still traveled. He still had investments. But something had changed. Whenever someone asked him what his greatest accomplishment was, he never mentioned his business. He never mentioned his income. He never mentioned the houses. He always told the same story. My father taught me too late that success isn't what you have. Then he would pause. It's who still wants you around when you have nothing to offer. Michael began telling the same story. Sarah did too. And slowly, their father's final lesson traveled beyond the family. Daniel began speaking to business groups about wealth and family. He told people, don't wait until your parents are dying to become a son again. He told successful people, your parents don't need your money nearly as much as they need to know they still matter to you. And whenever someone asked him whether he regretted anything, Daniel never hesitated. Yes. Then came the sentence that became his answer to everything. I regret becoming successful before I understood what success was. Sarah's story was different. For years, she had been so focused on caring for everyone else that she had forgotten to live her own life. Robert's final instructions changed that. She took the year for herself. She traveled. She reconnected with friends. She started doing things she had postponed for years. And eventually, she understood another lesson her father had left behind. Sacrifice is not supposed to become an identity. Sarah had spent years resenting her brothers for leaving. But eventually, she realized she had also allowed their absence to consume her. She forgave them. More importantly, she forgave herself. She stopped asking why she had been the one left behind, and started asking what she wanted to do with the life she still had. That was perhaps the greatest gift Robert had given her. Not money. Permission. Permission to live. Years passed. Daniel and Michael remained close. Not perfect. No family is. They still argued. They disagreed. They had different personalities. But now, when something mattered, they talked. When one needed help, the other answered. When Sarah called, they picked up. They understood something they had once ignored. Family does not survive because people never hurt one another. Family survives when people decide the relationship is worth repairing. And then, one afternoon, Daniel returned to the old house alone. He stood in the kitchen. The same kitchen where Robert had once sat with a cold cup of coffee. The same room where his father had told him, I never wanted your money. Daniel placed his hand on the table. He closed his eyes. And for a moment, he imagined his father sitting there. Daniel whispered, I finally understand. The house was quiet. There was no answer. But Daniel didn't need one. He already knew. The Whitmore family story was never really about rich children abandoning poor parents. It was about something much more common. It was about what happens when people become so focused on building a future that they stop noticing the people who helped them reach it. Money did not destroy the Whitmore family. Money revealed what they had allowed themselves to become. Daniel believed money could buy security. Michael believed success could erase the insecurity of childhood. Sarah believed responsibility meant carrying everyone. Robert believed that if he loved his children enough, they would always find their way home. Each of them was wrong about something, and each of them learned too late. But perhaps the most important lesson is this. Regret is not the same as redemption. Regret says, I wish I had done things differently. Redemption says, I will live differently because of what I did. Daniel could never bring Robert back. Michael could never recover the years he had lost. Sarah could never erase the nights she spent waiting for her brothers. But they could change what happened next. And sometimes, that is the only form of justice life gives us. So let me ask you something. Imagine you are Robert. You spent your entire life working for your family. You helped your children through school. You sacrificed vacations. You drove an old car so they could have better opportunities. You celebrated every achievement. You stood beside them when they failed. Then one day, they become wealthy. And slowly, they stop calling. They stop visiting. They start treating your home like an asset. They start discussing your future without asking what you want. Would you forgive them? Would you let them come back? Would you leave them the house? Would you divide everything equally? Or would you decide that some wounds are simply too deep? Now imagine you are Daniel. You have money. You have success. You have everything you once dreamed about. But one day you realize the people you worked so hard to impress are no longer there to see it. What would you trade to get one more dinner with your father? One more phone call? One more Christmas? One more chance to hear him say, "My boy"? That is the question the Whitmore family leaves behind. Because there are some things money can replace, and some things it never can. If there is one lesson in Robert Whitmore's story, it is not that money is bad. Money can provide security. It can create opportunities. It can protect families from hardship. There is nothing wrong with becoming successful. The danger begins when success convinces you that the people who loved you before you had anything are somehow less valuable after you have everything. Your parents will get older. Your children will grow up. Friends will move away. People you believe will always be there may not always be there. And one day, you may suddenly realize that the person you kept telling yourself you would visit next week is no longer waiting. That is why the most important question is not, how much money have I made? It is, who did I become while making it? Daniel Whitmore spent years trying to escape the life his parents had given him. Eventually, he understood that the life he was trying to escape was the greatest gift he had ever received. A family that loved him before he was successful. A mother who waited. A father who forgave him. A sister who never stopped showing up. And a home that remained open even after he stopped coming through the door. Years later, Daniel still kept Robert's final letter. It was folded carefully inside a wooden box. He could have stored it digitally. He could have made copies. He could have placed it somewhere safe and forgotten about it. Instead, he kept it beside an old photograph of the family. Whenever life became overwhelming, he opened the box. He read the letter, and he remembered. Not the money, not the houses, not the arguments, not the inheritance. He remembered being 8 years old. He remembered sitting on his father's shoulders. He remembered his mother's voice calling everyone inside for dinner. He remembered Michael laughing beside him. He remembered Sarah chasing them through the yard. He remembered a time when having less did not feel like having less. It felt like having enough. And perhaps that was what Robert had been trying to teach him all along. You can spend your entire life becoming richer. But if you lose the people you would have shared it with, what exactly did you gain? There was one sentence Robert had written that Daniel never forgot. If you ever lose your way, come home. Daniel had lost his way. Michael had lost his way. Sarah had nearly lost herself trying to hold everyone together. But eventually, they came home. Not because the house was valuable. Not because there was money waiting for them. Not because an inheritance was at stake. They came home because they finally understood what home meant. Home was Robert waiting at the kitchen table. Home was Evelyn's voice. Home was 3 children arguing over nothing. Home was forgiveness. Home was belonging. And when Robert was gone, the house became something else. A reminder. A warning. A place where 3 siblings could finally understand that the greatest inheritance their parents had left them was not property. It was each other. Maybe that is why stories like this stay with us. Because most of us have someone we keep telling ourselves we will call later. Someone we keep meaning to visit. Someone we assume will always be there. But life does not make promises about tomorrow. So if there is someone in your life you love, tell them. If there is someone you have been avoiding, ask yourself why. And if there is a parent, sibling, child, or friend who has been waiting for you to come home, perhaps don't wait for the perfect moment. Sometimes the perfect moment is simply the moment you realize how valuable that person really is. Robert Whitmore spent his final years wishing his sons would come home. Eventually, they did. But they learned the hardest lesson possible. Coming home after losing someone is not the same as coming home while they are still waiting for you. So before you leave, tell us in the comments. If you were Robert, would you have forgiven Daniel and Michael? And if you were Daniel, would you have given up some of your wealth to have one more year with your father? Most importantly, ask yourself this. Are you so busy building the life you want that you are forgetting the people who helped you build it? Because one day, the money may still be there. The house may still be there. The business may still be there. But the person waiting for your phone call may not be. If this story touched you, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss one of our upcoming stories. Because sometimes the greatest stories aren't about people who became rich. They're about the people who discovered, far too late, what wealth could never buy. And for Daniel Whitmore, that lesson came down to 4 simple words his father had written before he died. If you ever lose your way, come home.